Ready, set, showtime. Welcome to the Montana Majority Report. Quick, transparent, and informative. Get the inside scoop on policies, people, and decisions shaping our state, all in less time than it takes to pour your morning coffee. Stay tuned. Montana starts right here.
I'm Bill Mercer. I'm a Republican representative in the State House from Billings. I represent House District 52. And I'm with my Republican colleague, John Fitzpatrick, who represents House District 76. And we have both been deeply engaged in prison policy work as legislators. John, how did you first get interested in the topic?
Well, interestingly enough, life for me on this issue seems to have been circular because I started working on correctional issues in the 1970s. When I was a staff member in the Office of Budget and Program Planning, initially working with both human service budgets in what is now DPHHS, as well as correctional issues, which were then in the Department of Institutions. And I was around at the time when the new prison was built in Deer Lodge. It's interesting that many of the issues that we are talking about today, 50 years later, were very much present then. And it's like the system has gotten bigger, it's gotten more complex, but many of the same issues are still the ones that we had 50 years ago.
Yeah, and for me, I started my career as a federal prosecutor, so I didn't have any interaction with the state criminal justice system, but I would see defendants coming into the federal system in Montana who had been through the state criminal justice system. And one of the things that was a recurring concern was it seemed like people could have multiple convictions in the state criminal justice system and never get a sentence at Deer Lodge. And so there was this sense that we'd look at people who all of a sudden after 4 state convictions would be getting charged in federal court, and they'd be looking at a substantial sentence for drug trafficking or a firearm offense. And all of a sudden, they were going to go for 10 years or 15 years, and they just basically had slaps on their wrist for a long time. So I came to the legislature with a concern that the state criminal justice system was sort of more butter than guns, and that we really had an accountability problem. And we've had some pretty interesting times working together on this in especially the last 18 months, 2 years, going back to the last session. You might want to talk about some of the things that you worked on. We came at this differently because you were working on Section F, the long-range building part of the budget, and I was working on the Department of Corrections budget in another appropriations subcommittee. But at the end of the day, we really had a lot of joint efforts together.
Well, that's true. I think one of the things that really hit home in the last session was just exactly how problematic the system was in terms of bed capacity. I mean, I had no idea when I was running for office and talking with people that the state prison in Deer Lodge was basically full, that the women's prison at that time was within a hair's breadth of being full, the community correction facilities were being full, and we still had thousands of people with felony warrants against them that weren't being worked because we simply had no capacity in the system. I did carry House Bill 819, which was actually intended to accelerate some development in Montana State Prison coming out of the 2003 session. We actually appropriated about $220 million to upgrade that facility, to add some new housing units, to get rid of some obsolete housing units. And we're making progress on it, but it's a slow process, particularly when you go through the state procurement process. This time we'll be looking at another 500 beds for Deer Lodge, and I simply hope that that's enough. But given what seems to be happening in the criminal justice system, I'm concerned that we're going to get back here 2 years from now and find out that maybe things haven't changed very much.
Yeah. The other thing we did, and we really teamed up on this one, was jail hold issues. And that's a term that I don't think the public really understands. But when we in the legislature refer to jail holds, what we mean is that we have people that are in their sheriff's custody. They're in the local detention center or they're in the local jail, and they're being held there. Some of those people have already been sentenced in state court, and so the Department of Corrections is going to get them. But we have a significant problem in Billings, and it's not limited to Billings. It's in Ravalli County. It's a lot of places where The sheriff says, I'm full up, and when the department isn't getting people out of my facility and into their facilities, that hurts our ability to bring people in on warrants and others that need to be detained. And so we teamed up last session on that idea of trying to acquire some out-of-state beds. And although there were some people in the legislature that didn't like the idea, I know you've been down and looked at it, and you can talk about that. But I will say one of the things that worries me coming into this session is even though we appropriated that money to get some people down to Arizona, our problem is bigger today in terms of jail hold than it was when we were here 2 years ago.
Well, absolutely. I mean, I've been watching the statistics, and I'm sure you have. We're seeing numbers of 400, 450 people routinely. It fluctuates a few each week, but nonetheless, it's an enormous problem. I do think that the Department of Corrections has been very responsible about trying to work on that problem. We started that off with appropriating monies to start sending folks to Arizona, and you're correct, I did visit that facility in February, and frankly, I was very impressed. I have been in a number of different institutional settings, and I can say without fear of contradiction that was the cleanest penal facility that I have ever been in. And it had a very, very good design where our Montana prisoners were isolated from the folks that were in there for other reasons. That facility was being used extensively by the state of Hawaii as well as Idaho, but our inmates were segregated. Now, as I understand it, the Department of Corrections has sent 360 inmates to Arizona, and are looking at a potential of another 240 to a facility in Mississippi. And hopefully that'll make some kind of a serious dent in the jail hold problem on the male side. But we still have the problem on the female side where there's no space out of state where we can send them, and the women's prison is full. And frankly, as I look at it, I don't think we have any alternative except to look at a brand new facility for women's prisoners.
Yeah. And people that are listening to this who haven't spent as much time working on the issue as you and I have might say, good grief, how in the world do we have such a pronounced problem kind of coming out of nowhere? And I think there are a couple of different ways to answer the question. And we were on that House Bill 5 interim study committee. And if anybody wants to see the report from our subcommittee, I think it does a really good job of sort of sketching the history of corrections and secured facilities and how many beds we have. And the fact is that this isn't the first time that the state has studied this issue and said, boy, we better add some capacity. But then they didn't actually add capacity. So in a sense, we're trying to play catch up. But the thing that really has stuck with me, in addition to your comment about the women's offender population is growing, and the women offenders are more serious. They're committing more serious crimes, and they have more serious criminal histories. And of course, that's exactly the situation with the males. So when I've been talking to people about this, I say, you can't push people out of the python as quickly as you could have before, because their crimes are they're more violent crimes, they're more serious crimes, and the people that are committing those crimes have significant criminal histories. So even with parole, they're not parole eligible as soon as they might have been, an offender 5 years ago might have been. And that was what that consultant that was hired by DOC looking at our current population, she said, you're not going to be able to double bunk as many of these people, and you're going to have to hold them longer before they're parole eligible. And so we were short of capacity, and this is going to aggravate it even more.
Absolutely correct. Well, it's interesting that the overall crime rate in Montana has been dropping, but the violent crime rate and sexual offenses have actually been increasing. And sexual offenses are actually very, very problematic for the Department of Corrections because those folks are in the system on average 32 years, 24 years of which is spent behind the wall and 8 years under supervision. Another sidebar to that is that most of these folks that are in for sexual offenses are generally not caught until they're in their 40s or 50s after they've been plying their trade for quite a while. They get into the system, and then we end up creating another problem, and that is they age there, and now we have a geriatric problem with a whole set of medical conditions that we now need to take care of. That type of population never existed in the Montana correctional system 50 years ago. But we literally have a building at Deer Lodge that has a large part of its population of men on walkers and in wheelchairs who are aging behind the walls.
Yeah. So I think we're going to have another ambitious agenda this session in terms of this issue. It seems like in terms of not only what you're talking about in terms of 500 additional beds, I think that we at least have to have a conversation about what we're going to do to try to expand capacity for women offenders. And we should make sure to note for the audience that we've talked about the out-of-state beds that we were able to acquire in Arizona and that the department seems to be transitioning to in Mississippi. But we've been advised that there are no such opportunities for women offenders. So we can place men out of state in this period of time where we're trying to add to our capacity, but we can't do that with the women offenders.
No, that's absolutely correct. We don't have any choice. We have to find a way of adding more space for women. I'm hopeful that we will be able to bring up with a bill this year that may not designate a specific amount of money for the women's prison, but I think we will have the ability to kind of come up with a preliminary plan and work on it during the biennium with some money to back that up.
Yeah. Well, and I think it also is Montana has grown a fair amount, and I think we also need to acknowledge that if you're going to have an additional 100,000 people in the state beyond what you had at the time of the census in 2010, we shouldn't be shocked that we've got a greater set of people that are, you're going to have an average. And with those additional people in the state, you're probably going to have a higher crime rate than you would have, or a higher incidence of crime than you would have had in the absence of them coming to the state.
Well, that's right. I think the thing that we're also beginning to see, and I think you'd know this better, that as we get communities like Billings that are becoming growing urban areas, they start to develop an urban crime profile, which is very different from what we see in our smaller rural communities. And, of course, that's what feeds into this whole jailhold population, which is largely a problem that exists in our larger counties. Our rural counties have relatively small problem in that direction. But I think we're seeing a change in the criminal profile in Montana as well.
Yeah, and I certainly in Billings, one of the issues has been an increase in juveniles committing significant crimes, and we don't spend a lot of time talking about that because we don't have local capacity to hold juveniles who've been adjudicated. DOC doesn't have that. We need out-of-state placements to deal with that population, and that's going to be another challenge if we continue to see juveniles committing higher rates of serious crime. They're not adjudicated typically as adults, but they need to be held accountable, and in some cases they need to be incapacitated. So that's another one around the corner that I think we have to be prepared to deal with.
Well, I think what we're looking at, frankly, is reinventing the wheel. Going back to the time when I was in the budget office, we had the State School for Boys in Miles City, and I don't absolutely remember the statistics, but I think we had close to about 80 inmates down there. And we had Mountain View School out here in the Helena Valley for girls, and I think that population was probably in the neighborhood of 35 to 40. Well, the population of juvenile females in custody in Montana is basically in the Department of Corrections is down to 8, and they're all out of state. And the population at Pine Hills is probably down around 20. Well, given the nature of what's happening with juvenile crime, that's probably far too few inmates in that kind of an environment, and we're probably going to have to take a serious look at beefing up that system as well.
Yeah. Well, and I think one of the things that you and I came into the legislature after the 2017 session, but I think one of the really interesting things about what the debate has been like since I've been here since 2019 is in 2017, there was a pretty spirited debate about let's not prosecute certain misdemeanors, let's lower some sentences for certain crimes. There was sort of what I'd call almost a 1970s mindset of, hey, crime is, if we only treat offenders differently and maybe invest more in education and treatment, that will take care of this problem. And we've seen that movie before. I mean, that movie was a 60s and 70s movie, and then we got into the later 70s and 80s, and as a society, we snapped back and said, no, it was the Rudy Giuliani broken windows, and it was really a mindset of you got to hold people accountable, because if you don't, that's corrosive to society as a whole. And I wish we had a way to sort of bottle that as an elixir so we didn't have to go through these periods where people got enamored with the idea saying, oh, no, if you just back off and don't incarcerate as much, don't try to hold people accountable, that's the best way to have, a safe society. People seem to fall for that every 20 or 30 years. And I don't know how we can get past that. But certainly we're in a period now where I think we've turned that corner and we're serious about enforcement and prosecution and detention.
Well, we need to. Frankly, I have never bought the theory that you're getting a better outcome by essentially not prosecuting someone for a crime. I realize that, particularly with youth, there can be lots of different kinds of extenuating circumstances, but if you don't hold people accountable for their behavior, then it tends to get worse. I have never seen a situation in a correctional system where community-based services actually had a major impact in keeping people out of prison. I mean, by the time someone gets to Deer Lodge, they've had 6 felony convictions on average, and they have been in and out of the system repeatedly. Well, basically, community-based corrections, I think, have a limited utility, but we're not, working as we should be with some of these harder cases.
Yeah. Well, it's really been a pleasure to work with you on these issues, and we got a lot more heavy lifting to do over the next 3.5 months, but look forward to it.
Well, same with me. I'll be working on the physical plant, and you can help with keeping the operational budget where we need it to be.
Very good.
Thank you.